Hello and welcome to episode 147 of The Dive Down, a Magic the Gathering podcast focused on the latest decks, trends, and strategies for the casual spike. My name is Stanislav here in Chicago, and with me on the line, maybe 4 or 5 miles to the west, it's the Godfather, Dave Harbarger.
I'm not in the basement this time.
I love your office. Your office looks nice.
I got books, and I'm not in the basement. I'm off hardwire connection, unfortunately, but it's been raining here all day to talk about I'm going to take over Shane's spot of talking about the weather, and the sump pit in my basement is filling with water. My fingers are crossed that it will do its thing, and we won't get any water.
Now, for the listeners at home, the sump pit has a sump pump.
Right.
And the sump pump is working right now because it's raining.
Yep. I hope it's working. Right now, it's just filling. It's getting to the point where it has to tip me over and pour me out, you know?
Right. We're waiting for that sump pump to turn on and start chugging water outside. Where does the water go, Dave?
Into my yard, just via a pipe out into the backyard. Yeah, and I didn't think people would want to hear the dripply, drabbly noise from that, and then maybe in the middle of it, either kicking on or me going, oh, my basement's filling with water.
Yeah, I'm glad that didn't happen. I am disappointed that Shane's not here today.
Mm-hmm. Well, he got flooded away.
Yeah, he went down the river Styx.
Yeah, down the Colorado River. He's in my sump pump.
Your sump pump. So he's going to end up in your front yard. We just don't know when.
Right, eventually. We'll probably hear it. He's pretty loud when he yells.
That's right. I don't know if I've ever heard him yell with his voice, just with his tone.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean?
He's just kind of a stern adversary. Stan, you said that you found a new Beach Boys song that you're obsessed with.
Yeah.
It's on Surf's Up. That is the dark ending of a certain era of the Beach Boys, depending on how you calculate things.
Yeah, the song is Feel Flows. It was the closing credits of the film Almost Famous, which I revisited yesterday because my wife had never seen it. And, it's kind of a teenage boy movie, but she got a kick out of it. And the song Feel Flows, what a beautiful track by the Beach Boys.
Mm-hmm.
Beach Boys kind of a blind spot for me musically. Like, I love the Beatles, the Who, Zeppelin. Like, I like a lot of bands from that era, but I never really got into the Beach Boys.
Have you listened to Pet Sounds much, though? Or are you conversant in Pet Sounds?
I've listened to a little bit of Pet Sounds, and the hits are great. Like, Stone Cold classics.
Yeah.
I don't know if I've ever really fallen in love with Pet Sounds as a record.
Oh, man, it's one of the best. It's one of the best front to back, I think.
All right, good to know.
My favorite, less heralded Beach Boys track would be, I think it's called I Can Hear Music, and it's on one of their later kind of like compilation-y ones, I think it is. And it's a bit of a radio banger kind of hit. Like, it sounds like a final top 40 play from a band that's kind of like losing their way a little bit, but it's a great hook. Great harmonies. Can I tell you a totally...
Great harmonies on a Beach Boys song?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, my legit favorite Beach Boys song is God Only Knows, but like, that's not a great answer.
Yeah, that's like saying your favorite rock song, Stairway to Heaven.
Exactly. Can I tell you a bit of an anecdote while we're here and there's only 2 of us taking up the oxygen this week?
What's great is with Shane gone, we can talk about whatever we want. We may or may not even touch on Magic today.
I think, we are going to talk about the magic of the Beach Boys today. I got to go to a DVD taping. I'm going to tie this back to Almost Famous, actually. Okay. Back like 2005, when Brian Wilson released Smile, he finally finished the album that sort of made him give up music for a while, and when he was really struggling with some of his struggles, there's this unfinished album called Smile that has a number of different things on it that he finished in like 2005 and released. And I knew somebody who took me along to a DVD taping that was going to go along with like the deluxe version of the album, and we were like seat fillers. Basically, so I flew out to LA, got to see the rehearsal day beforehand where they do the push. So when you do like a real DVD taping, they do a couple of different filming sets, right? And so they had one day where they're doing all the close-ups, and then they filmed another set in front of a live audience. I got to go to both of them. But at the second one, we were just hanging out, and, we were like, oh, look who's here. Like, there's Rick Rubin is here, and there's Sean Lennon here, and there's the guys from, what was the name of that band with Jack White and Brendan Benson? The Raconteurs. The guys from the Raconteurs are here, not Jack White. And then we're sitting like 10 rows back, and my friend was friends with the producer, and she came up and she said, hey, you got to we have some empty seats up front in row 3. Can you guys go sit in those seats so they're not empty? And we were like, okay. So we go sit down, and I sit down on the end seat. My friend sits in the next seat, and he looks over, and the person sitting next to him is Zooey Deschanel. actually. And sitting next to her is Jason Schwartzman. And then sitting next to him is his mom, Talia Shire. And then sitting next to her is Roman Coppola.
Oh my God. Well, that's Schwartzman's like step parent or something?
They're all Coppolas. Yeah.
Yeah, Schwartzman's a Coppola.
Yeah. So she's not, Zoe Deschanel isn't, and she looked at us and she's like, hi, like, who are you guys? And we're like, we are nobodies. And she was like, well, welcome.
We're just happy to be here.
Yeah. And she was like, well, welcome to Rosie, as in Coppola. And so tying it all back is that she was an Almost Famous. And at this point, she was really only known for Almost Famous and Elf. And that was it.
It was a breakout role for her.
Anyway.
Almost Famous, good movie. Feel Flows, beautiful song. It reminded me of Animal Collective.
Mm-hmm.
And it kind of like, I think it harkens to that Animal Collective sound that's inspired by the Beach Boys.
Yep. Which I think is the best Animal Collective sound, but that's just me because I'm kind of middle on Animal Collective. But hey, listen.
Good talk.
Everybody who's still here, I mean, some of this is going to get cut, but I just wanted
I hope not.
I didn't know what to do for the intro today, so I figured let's just go for it.
Maybe we should tell people what we're doing.
Mm-hmm.
Let's take a stab at it. Shane's gone, but we still played Magic. We played some 4-color piles in preparation for this week's episode. We started out exploring elementals and footfalls, and then we recognized that those were some really greedy decks, and we figured, why not make that the theme of the episode?
Greed?
Yeah, but not the card from MH2.
Oh, right. And Legends, for that matter.
Correct, yeah. So we're talking about elementals, we're talking about crashing footfalls, tying into the 4-color and the Temur versions of that deck.
Yeah, and this is chapter 3 of our Road to Vegas, I guess, really, where we look at all these 4-color-ish decks and talk about it.
That's right. We're also going to kick off with a look at the NRG Modern Trial that was held here in Chicago on Saturday. Pretty big publicized Modern Paper event. Big show out there, as well as the Saturday Modern Challenge, which had a Murderer's Row in the top 8. We're excited to cover the decks we saw there. Before all that, though, I know Shane's not here, but can we housekeep?
I mean, we're going to do it twice as long with Shane since Shane's not here. So let's just stretch out in this housekeeping segment.
Shout out to the newest patrons to join the Dive Down Nation, Mo S. and Chris S. No relation.
The S brothers, well known.
Yeah. From S brothers from other mothers, however.
Mm-hmm.
Also, thanks to some new reviews, we got overexcited about everything. That was their username.
Yeah, they gave us a sort of regular level of excitement review, which we very much appreciated. There weren't too many exclamation marks in it or anything like that. It just was a very nice thing that they said about us.
Yeah, really
iTunes.
well punctuated.
Yeah.
Also, thanks to Matthew R., who submitted a very friendly review to us via Poddenbox. So we got to hear his kind words, which was a really unique way to use Poddenbox. Thank you, Matthew. If anyone else wants to share feedback with us via Poddenbox, that's one way to do it. Or if you want to hear yourself on the podcast, The Dive Down, you can submit an audio snippet with a question to poddenbox.com/thedivedown, and you may hear it on a future episode.
And of course, the best way to kind of hang out with us and interact is by joining the Patreon. We're supported by the members of our Patreon. They make the show possible. It's patreon.com, the dive down, where as little as $1 an episode gets you access to the Discord server where we chat, talk about stuff, make friends, talk about the Beach Boys. A lot of Doonin' going on this week. A lot of people had takes about that particular piece of media. I haven't seen it yet. And yeah, so if you want to support us, please find us at patreon.com/the dive down. I will say, deck boxes. Here's an update. We have a date that we have to turn in the artwork from Legion Supplies, who are going to be making it. It's the end of the first week of November, so they will be done by then.
Whoa, this is news to me.
Yeah, they gave us like hey, if you guys want to get in the next batch of printing, this is when it's happening. So we need to do it.
Does that mean we have a idea of when the boxes will be in our hands to distribute?
I think it's probably a couple of months because they do take shipping. They're printed internationally. So it'll take some time still to get those from here, but that is when we will be finishing up the design work.
So we expect to ship deck boxes Q1 2022.
That's my guess. Don't expect them under your Christmas tree, but sometime after that, I would say under your holiday tree. I'm sorry to say that.
Yeah, maybe you can celebrate Chinese New Year with a dive down deck box.
Yeah, that sounds like maybe timing that could happen.
It could happen.
Yeah.
Also, if you want to support the show while playing Magic, we have a Mana Traders promo code. It's the Dive Down 2021. And if you use it, you'll get 15% off your first 2 months of playing Magic online via Mana Traders. All of these Road to Las Vegas episodes truly made possible by mana traders. So thank you.
I'll say, boy, Modern got expensive on Moto lately, hasn't it?
It sure has.
Yeah.
But that's not my problem. All right, with all that out of the way, let's just jump right into this breakdown. We got a lot of tournaments to cover, many decks.
Stan, are you going to be at the news desk today? You're doing this all, and I'm kind of adding the color commentary. I like that. I'm up for it.
I like that. All right, let's start with the Saturday Modern Challenge. It's got a lot of familiar names, which I think we're going to have fun talking about. You may have already heard some of these results. Let's just go through the top 8, starting with the winner of the event, up-and-coming Magic player Aspiring Spike.
Yes.
Took the whole thing down with Esper Reanimator.
Mm-hmm. Deck he's been playing a little bit lately. Maybe we could go into a little bit more depth about it, but once we go through the whole list. But I will say, this is Everett's first time winning a challenge. He mentioned, I guess he had come in second a few times. He's been in the top 8 many times, but this was the first challenge that he actually won.
Interesting. I do recall that time that I think he and Yama Killer ended in the finals of a PTQ, and Yama scooped to him because Yama was already qualified for the event.
Right, yeah.
But this is a different tournament.
Yep. Different tournaments. Everett has certainly won, but yeah, first time for the challenge.
Right on. Congrats, Everett.
Why don't we go into this deck a little bit, I guess?
Sure. It does have the body of what a lot of people might expect from a Modern Reanimator shell with your Persist, Unmarked Grave combo. He threw in Unburial Rites, Grief, Solitude, and Archon of Emeria.
Cruelty.
Archon of Cruelty, thank you.
I think Archon of Emeria is a different card.
Yeah, I just wrote Archon in my notes. What I think makes his Esper version a little bit unique is that he's also playing blue for cards such as Teferi, Time Raveler, Mold Drifter, and Faithful Mending.
Yes. Faithful Mending, I think people saw coming, right? Of course, it's Mold Drifter that seems to be the sort of like tech that people didn't think would make sense in a shell like this. But hey, guess what? We're going to be talking about Mold Drifter a lot this week because suddenly 2007's draft common staple is Modern's new little piece of tech that greases your wheels, I guess. But yeah, this deck, when you really look at it, it's not that many different cards. It's a pretty like svelte list. It's not trying to get tricky with it. There's no, Stoneforge package in here as a backup. It's just all in. There's not even a Sarah's Emissary main. There's only Sarah's Emissary in the sideboard to bring in for matchups where it matters. What you're really doing here is trying to win with Archon of Cruelty or through Grief/Solitude kind of combat if you get to that point. But this deck is very much in on the Ephemerate Grief plan as being the primary way that it does disruption.
Only 21 lands, which I thought was kind of surprisingly lean. And maybe the fact that we're using Faithful Mending to get through the deck and set up some of our graveyard payoffs helps find those land drops. But I would think with cards like Teferi, Time Raveler especially, and even Mold Drifter being sort of that 3 mana top of the curve, I would think you'd want more than 21, but here we are.
Don't need it. Second
place, Doomwake on 4-color Crashing Footfalls.
Yeah,
featuring Yorion.
What a finals, too. Yeah. Like Doomwake versus Everett. They certainly are two people who talk to each other a good amount. I think they've collaborated on things a couple of times here and there. But interesting to see these streamers keep rising to the top and making top 8s. And I know there's more in this top 8. But Doomwake kind of had the hype deck of the week, I would say, right, with this particular build.
That's right. It was so hyped that I'm not going to talk about it right now because I played it for the dive down, and I'll go into more details later. But this is a Yorion deck with a Crashing Footfalls combo in a controlling elemental package.
Yeah, 80-card deck. All right.
That's a lot of cards.
Who is next?
Third place, we got Canister with 4-color Ephemerate.
Wow.
That's another Yorion deck, by the way.
Amazing. Now, I will say we did not play this exact deck for this week, but we certainly will be talking about this kind of deck in the dive down as well, just because it's 4-color week, as we mentioned. But yeah, this is one of the more control-y kind of builds of this. It's less all in on the elemental idea and more all in and on Ephemerate and Yorion and good comes in play abilities. It has Eternal Witness and Ice Fang Coatl. It's got a Time Warp. So it's doing some stuff that's different from the 4-color elemental list that we saw earlier while featuring many of the same cards still.
Fourth place, Crusher Bot BG with Hammer Time.
That's right.
So this is listed as mono white hammer, but it does still have the silent clearings. And what looked a little bit unique about this deck to me is that it had a lot of equipment in the main deck.
Yes.
2 Paradise Mantle, a Sword of Fire and Ice, a Cranial Plating, and a Nettle Cyst, in addition to the hammers.
Yeah, and I think what we should talk about here is the thing about Crusherbot's list is that it does not play Luris as a result of having these extra search targets for Stoneforge Mystic in the deck. You lose the ability to play Luris, but they have been apparently playing this deck for a little bit. I read in Bamzing's post about this tournament that this player is kind of well known for this deck that also has sort of Fire and Ice and Nettle Cyst in it specifically that make you have a little bit of different outs or things to do with your mana, with your Stoneforge Mystics, and things to do with artifact synergy like Cranial Plating as a backup. The Cranial Plating I know comes up sometimes in Hammer, but it's a different take on Hammer for sure. One of the most interesting cards to me was 3 Defense Grid in the sideboard, which is like a card I haven't seen a ton of these days, but trying to make it more taxing for people to do things on your turn.
Yeah, they've also got a Sword of Sinew and Steel, which is the pro black-red sword in the sideboard. What do you think that's good for?
I mean, I imagine it's for the Junt matchup to turn off Junt's removal as much as you can. You know, it makes Terminate not work anymore. It makes Unholy Heat not work anymore.
Yeah, and you can blow up both Urza tokens or Ren and 6s if it connects.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, I was wondering, what are we trying to kill?
Oh, yeah, with the second trigger here. Whenever equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, destroy up to 1 target planeswalker and up to 1 target artifact. So, yeah, if you get through, you do get to take shots at some of those pieces that people have.
Mm-hmm. Cool deck. 5th place, Demonic Tutors on Yawgmoth. Now, Demonic Tutors is a known Yawgmoth player.
Mm-hmm. I believe won the challenge 2 weeks ago. Won a challenge on playing Yawgmoth and has been streaming it a lot. They're high on the leaderboard this time as well.
Yeah, so one Geralf's Messenger in this version of Yawgmoth, which I thought was pretty interesting because Geralf's Messenger is one of the key combo cards to kind of win with Yawgmoth on the spot. And instead they've got an Endurance in addition to that Messenger, I think, in that slot. Just another powerful tool to kind of go up the chain and Eldritch Evolution into.
Yep, exactly. And our, we have a very dedicated Yawgmoth player in our Discord community named Aaron, who was talking a little bit about this earlier and participates in the Yawgmoth kind of Discord as well. And he had told us that Demonic Tutors has kind of crafted this deck to make it much more all in on the combo version instead. And so that doesn't necessarily mean that you need more pieces, like more redundancy in the combo. What you do is you plan to like search it up with your, you plan to use that as a combo piece only. So you really don't ever want to draw Geralf's Messenger. You want to tutor it up later when you're ready to actually try to win. That's why you're doing it that way.
With Eldritch Evolution or your Court of Calling.
Right.
6th place, we got ETW for the win on Temur Footfalls.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty stock list. 7th place, Sneaky Misato on another 4-color Ephemerate deck featuring Yorion.
Very close to Canister's list, glancing over it right now.
Yeah. And in 8th place, Zikari on Affinity featuring Yagantha.
I did not notice that the 8th place person in this challenge was on Affinity. That is very cool.
Yeah. And I was wondering whether all these 4 or more mana artifact creatures with Affinity are actually good right now against a lot of decks that are counting on things like Prismatic Ending as their primary removal spell.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe this is just vulnerable to Supreme Verdict, but it can otherwise, go pretty wide and go big and kind of dodge a lot of removal, or at least some of the more popular removal that's in the format right now.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense.
Sort of Sinew and Steel seems pretty good against this deck, though.
Right. Gonna get rid of an artifact every time if you hit them. All right, so like we said, the finals ended up being Aspiring Spike versus Doomwake. It was quite a match. I actually tuned in time to watch the finals itself. I think it's worth going back and watching either on Doomwake's stream or Everett's stream. The final match itself was pretty short. The first game went to Doomwake pretty quickly, and then the second game went to Everett pretty quickly, and then the third game was pretty interesting. Kind of like Everett had to mull the 5, and then ended up being able to Grephemerate on turn 1 to be able to do some, take a bunch of cards away from Doomwake, and then managed to draw into mana to cast Teferi on turn 3 when Doomwake did not have a forced negation to stop it from happening. And so it really disrupted kind of Doomwake's plans, and then there were a couple more key decisions after that, and that was kind of like basically enough to seal the deal.
Interesting.
It was a cool match, though.
Yeah. In terms of this overall metagame breakdown from the top 32, Temur Footfalls was in fact the most popular deck in the tournament with 4 copies. And then we had a bunch of 3-ofs, including 4-color Ephemerate, Yawgmoth was a 3-of, Jund Saga, and Hammer Time.
Wow, amazing.
Yeah, Yawgmoth getting really popular there.
That's a lot more than you would usually expect to see in one of these tournaments, especially in the top 32. These usually have, I think, around 90 people in them. So, yeah, keep your eye on Yawgmoth, I guess.
Yeah. And then we got a bunch of one-ofs, but coming up the rear, 2 copies each of Bring to Lightscape Shift and Blue-White Control featuring Kahira. So kind of the spread we would expect. Less Murktide, less burn than perhaps we're used to. But otherwise, Blue-White Control, Hammer, Footfalls, Jund Saga, still leading the pack. And then we got a couple, these more up-and-coming decks, whether it's these 4-color Ephemerate versions or even Black-Green Yawgmoth, which has been around for a while, but I think people are starting to take more and more notice of this deck's potential, especially in the hands of really dedicated pilots.
Yep. Yeah, it really felt like this week that 4-color was just everywhere on social media and it was everywhere in the queues when I played. So I think we have good timing for the decks we decided to play this week as well.
It does make me wonder whether this is the week to play Blood Moon main. Whether you can play a Blue Moon or a Ponza-style deck and see if you can try to punish people who are going after whether it's these 3-color control decks or even some of these 4-color elemental-backed, piles, essentially.
Well, I'll tell you what, it's not easy to get out of Blood Moon with the deck that I played for sure. So we'll see. I'm not sure if it's going to be that way going forward, but I think that playing Blood Moon this week probably could have been a good, helpful thing. And actually, speaking of that, why don't we talk about this modern Nerd Rage Games tournament that happened on Saturday as well. Live paper tournament in Chicago from well-known shop out in the suburbs here, Nerd Rage Games. They do generally have coverage. I don't think they had coverage this time, but they have at different points in time. So we'd like to support Nerd Rage by giving them a little bit of a head nod here on the show. And plus, it's Paper Modern tournament. Let's go through the top 8. Robert Hayes won the tournament on 4-color elementals. Kind of a stock list you have noted here, Stan, but they were running Lightning Bolts and Lightning Helix, which doesn't happen in every single one of these decks.
Correct. Yeah. These elemental decks, I've seen some prismatic endings. I'll see interaction here and there, but the power of these elementals, especially these new ones, is they get to replace these spells. But Robert or Bob decided otherwise. So I thought that was kind of a neat juke.
Yeah. I think that it does depend sometimes on if you want to have reach, right? Like sometimes it helps. The deck that I played, and we can talk about this more later, actually favored Robert's list has Teferi Time Raveler on it. Mine only had Ren and 6. And so I can see in the decks where you're playing Ren and 6, maybe playing Lightning Bolt occasionally so that you can get some value out of the ultimate if you manage to get there. Not too much to do in the list with it in the list that I was, but Robert's running Teferi here. So maybe it's just for a little bit of extra removal, a little bit of extra reach.
Second place, Daniel, MTG, with Demir Mill.
Nothing too new there, although it is interesting to see Mill make the end of a paper tournament like this, one of the first ones.
Yeah. And Mill is one of those decks, especially with all the tools that they've been getting in the last year, that really easy to hate if you're prepared for it. And I think even Endurance is a really solid card against Mill, which is a pretty popular sideboard card right now. You just Endurance targeting yourself. Mm-hmm. But if you're not prepared for Mill, it's like Dredge used to be, where it's just going to run away with the tournament and take everyone by surprise. And I wonder if that's what happened here.
Absolutely. Third place, Matt Dow on Orzhov Hammer, Hammer list. We got it. It's here. This one is one that is also, it is running Luris still, so it's more of a standard build.
Yeah, fourth place, Connor Mullally on Temur Crashing Footfalls. Pretty stock.
Yep, good deck. Does good.
Here's a good one for us. Fifth place, Philip Nguyen on Is It Control? This is Blue Moon, dog.
Well, we knew that you would want to stop on this deck if we had any reason to. Here it is. What's Blue Moon look like this week? 4
Snapcaster Mage, 4 Murktide Regent, 1 Brazen Borrower, 2 Blood Moon, and then a bunch of spells.
Mm-hmm.
Included Electrolyze.
1 Electrolyze.
We're running Electrolyze. Probably great against Hammer,
Yeah.
To be honest.
Get a couple of X1s.
Yeah.
Good against Hammer, not good against Ragavan. Really. You know what I mean? Because it's too late. By the time.
Although eventually you're dashing Ragavan.
No, that's true.
It's probably good against a dashed Ragavan.
Yep.
And maybe even okay against Dragon's Rage Channeler if the graveyard hasn't been,
properly deliriumized.
Yep. Yeah. It's something I've noticed about these Blue Moon decks, especially the ones that the Pensword has been working on, is with the addition of Murktide Regent, all of their cantrips are filling up the yard. They're playing 4 Thoughtscour, 4 Consider, which in turn then makes your Snapcaster mages even better. So you don't necessarily have to count on, finding a counter spell the first time in order to snap it back later. You can just mill it into your graveyard. And these decks fill up the yard pretty quickly from what I've seen in some of Jacob's streams.
It's interesting to see this take where it's not as aggressive, right, as people were, as like what we think of for Murktide. It's like a bigger version of Murktide now where we're snapping stuff and Brazen Borrowing. All right, sixth place, we have Azorius Control. Pretty stock version of this. 3 Chalice main, a couple of Shark Typhoon, a couple of Spreading Seas. Good deck. Very familiar with what we've pretty much maps exactly with, I think, the deck that you would have been playing last week. Stan still has 2 Memory Deluge main.
Exactly the same as the one I played last week.
That's awesome. You still like this deck? I guess we'll find out. Yeah.
I mean, it's got one card in there that I think is really, really good, but we'll talk about that card a bit more later.
Okay.
And then 7th place, Victor Wood on 4-color Rhinos. This is a Yorion deck.
So this is the Doomwake deck, basically, from earlier last week. Someone picked it up and took it into paper and managed to top 8 with it as well.
Yeah, I think this is Doomwake's exact list, even. I'm kind of checking out the sideboard, and it looks like this person acted fast. So there you go. And then someone else took it to a top 8.
That's right. And then 8th place, Dale Gamise with Red, White, Burn. No deck list available of that one right now, but made it in the top 8 at 6, 2, and 1. All right, so there were 200 players who played in this tournament, right, Stan?
Yeah, like 211. And among them, we know 186 of the decks that are on MTG Melee's website for this particular tournament. So of those 186, we do have a little bit of a metagame snapshot. So I didn't go through it manually to organize all these decks. MTG Melee organized it a little bit for us. I think because we don't have all the deck lists, these percentages might be a little wonky, but they give us a sense of what was popular throughout the day. And the most popular deck, according to MTG Melee, was Jund.
No kidding. In a paper tournament, Jund was the most popular deck?
Dave, I've always said the Midwest is a very Jund meta.
That's right. I think it just means
here we are.
People are trying to play paper Magic again, and they're all getting their Jund decks out. I wonder how many of them were foil.
I would say most of them. 21 of these 186 decks, about 11% were Jund.
Wow. 10% of the field is actually pretty big. I keep thinking about last week when I said that Jund was going to be 7.5% of the meta at Vegas. And I was like, that's big, actually. I stick by what I said last week where I thought it might be the 4th or 5th most played deck. But I think in that case, Metashare is probably lower than 7.5%. But don't, sound off in the comments.
Look, it's a good bet because Jund is just like this super popular paper deck. People like to Jund them out, Jund out their opponents, have expensive cards. I think it's half the appeal of Modern is having these super expensive decks. So you can sort of see why, Jund might have been the most popular deck, at least this weekend in Chicago.
Followed by another very expensive deck.
Blue-White Control came in 2nd place, 17 copies, just under 10%. These two are like 2 peas in a pod in terms of like what modern paper players love to gravitate towards. I think you're either a Jund player or a Blue-White Control player at heart, or Tron is the third one of the trifecta. Maybe we can throw Burn in there.
Yeah, I think Burn is somewhere in that map too.
It's the 4 poles of our circus tent, right?
It's a pretty boring circus tent if it's only got 4 corners. Don't those usually have 6, 12, 9 corners, something fun?
I'm not an architect, Dave.
Okay.
I'm a marketer. So yeah, Blue-White Control 2nd place. 3rd place was Burn, 14 copies, 8%. Up next, Black-White Hammer, 13 copies. So that's coming up in paper. Is It Tempo was really popular, 5th most popular deck with 11 copies. And then the last of the 5 or more copies bracket were Eldrazi Tron and 4-color Elementals. And then the remaining 100 or so decks that MTG Melee has spelled out fell into the other bracket. I think a lot of these decks are named by the player.
Yeah.
And I think for that reason, that also skews the data because, 4-color Rhinos or Crashing Footfalls might have come up as different decks in this data. So maybe someone who wants to like take the time to do the spreadsheets manually will find that certain other decks were also very popular.
Yeah, but Stan has a baby. He didn't have a chance to do it. So we didn't do it this week.
I'm retired from pivot tables.
Yep, for now. You'll be back. You can't stay away. You can't stop the pivot. We know you can't.
I know.
You love
That's
it.
True.
Well, awesome. Well, thanks for putting together this breakdown of some really fun tournaments that happened this weekend. I know that there were some other tournaments on Magic Online this weekend. I think there was 2 PTQs, another challenge, of course. There's a lot going on. A lot of people playing Modern these days. It really feels like people are putting effort in and having a good time, I think. So with that in mind, we're going to continue trying to help people get ready for the big GP non-GP coming up in Vegas in about 3 weeks. So stay with us. All right. Thanks for sticking with us, and welcome to part 3 of the Road to Vegas, which means that right now we are driving, I guess, somewhere between, I don't know, where does the Road to Vegas go? Are we on Route 66? Are we in Radiator Springs? Is that what's happening?
Yeah, I mean, we did have to stop for gas.
Mm-hmm. At Radiator Springs.
Yeah, and then MapQuest took us through some country roads.
Mm-hmm.
So at this point, we're just trying to find some lights to follow and figure out where civilization is.
Perfect. And the bright lights of the big city of Vegas are coming up somewhere. We're continuing to take a tour around the modern meta right now. We've been having fun with this. I hope that people have been having fun listening too, just trying out different decks and just looking at the top decks in the meta right now. And we kind of realized that one group of decks that we talked about a little bit last week is really ascending, and that is basically all these 4-color piles, all kinds of different 4-color decks. And there's a lot of them, really. And I don't think that they're the same deck at all. We did kind of want to think about them all as a group because they share some common cards and they share some common play patterns. And so when you look around the meta, especially, we just talked about 2 really good and representative tournaments, I think, of what the meta is like. There's basically 4-ish different things, right? So there's kind of your old school 4-color elementals that are in on elemental tribal in a way. They have Risen Reef in the deck still to be able to feature as a payoff for playing other elementals to use to draw cards. Mole Drifter is in there. You have your Omnath kind of thing going on. If you step 1 degree away from those decks, I kind of hinted towards this earlier in the breakdown. There's sort of these 4-color control-ish shells, and we've talked about them a few different times, that these are control decks that are sort of akin to where the meta started to go before Field of the Dead was banned, where you have these kind of Omnath control decks that have core creature interaction elementals like Fury and Solitude still in their deck list, but they don't have Risen Reef. They don't necessarily have other things that capitalize on elemental strategy like Flamekin Harbinger that appears in the elemental list, sometimes stuff like that. What they have instead are other cards that are good with Ephemerate instead of elementals. Things like Icefang Coatl, things like Eternal Witness. They have more spells. Sometimes they have more counter spells. Sometimes they have more lightning bolts and things like that in them. So they're a bit more control-ish. And then sometimes either one of these decks become 80-card decks that are Yorion decks, right? So you have control decks that are trying to do Ephemerate type things. The Yorion decks that get to that size, sometimes they're trying to do infinite turns combos with Eternal Witness and Ephemerate and Time Warp and things like that. They're usually playing Renin 6 and Teferi 3. Sometimes the regular elemental creatures decks kind of swell up to be Yorion decks as well. So that's kind of maybe 2 other shells that fit this. And then finally, we have these decks that play either these control or kind of creature value games, but then they also jam a combo into them. Now, previous weeks to now, you would see occasionally things like Saheeli Rai and Felidar Guardian in a deck like this, because actually Saheeli Rai and Felidar Guardian are both pretty good with creatures that have come into play abilities, right? Because you can make a copy of it or you can blink them with those cards. If you get both of them, Yahtzee, you get an infinite combo and you can try to finish the game that way as well. But what's happened this week is that the deck that Doomwake brought to the table or kind of helped design recently brings that Cascade shell combined together with elementals. So you have these kind of ones that are a bit more combo-ish in the zone as well. But the key is, I've been seeing a lot of these over the last week or two. And I think that while they are very different decks, like I said, I do think there's a common core of good cards that unify these disparate versions into sort of cousins of each other. What do you think about that, Stan?
I think you're onto something. I do think there are several important cards that kind of keep it all together that are indicative of the power level of going into all these extra colors and sort of the ceiling that they hit. And I think maybe what we'll talk about today is whether or not these cards contribute to positive or even negative gameplay experiences and how they actually can impact the different metagames that we're seeing right now and really the top decks within the metagame too.
Yeah. For now, let's talk about what these cards are. So everybody close your eyes, as long as you're not driving. Close your eyes and imagine the first card that we're going to talk about that's in all of these decks. So Stan, the first card that comes to mind when you're thinking about these decks, what is it?
It's low-key become the most popular creature in Modern, or so it feels. And
so it's Dragon's Rage Channeler?
It's the other one.
Okay. Ragavan?
The one in the best color.
Tell us what it is.
It's Solitude.
It is.
Should we read these cards? People know what Solitude is. If you're in our van on the road to Las Vegas trying to find, how to read these directions, you know what Solitude is.
Yeah, if you don't know what Solitude is, we're going to drop you off in Tucson alone where you can experience some Solitude.
So Solitude in and of itself, great threat, but it also helps answer your opponent's creatures. And people are now starting to abuse it in a variety of shells. We see it in control decks like Blue-White Control we talked about last week. We're seeing it in the Elementals Tribal deck. And we're just seeing in some of these good stuff mid-range piles.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I think when these cards were spoiled, these evoke elementals, everyone was like, these are going to be awesome with Ephemerate. And then that's where you're really kind of like doing it, where you're like, oh, if I get Solitude into play and Ephemerate, I get to get rid of 3 creatures ultimately as a result of it. And also keep my card for the low price of 3 cards of my own and 1 mana, which is really incredible for efficiency's sake. But there are a lot of decks that don't even bother trying to do blinky stuff with these cards. They're that good. And like Stan said, they're in blue-white. It's in blue-white. It's all over the place, but it's one of the key cards for sure in all of these 4 color piles. They all have 4 Solitude main.
Okay, another one also appears in some control decks, but not the blue-white ones, and that's Fury.
Fury and Solitude, interesting kind of like partners in crime, because what they do is they provide a lot of free ways for your decks to interact with creatures for no mana, right? So you give yourself temporary card disadvantage or sometimes not even card disadvantage, depending on what happens when you cast a Fury, to be able to have a really incredible creature interaction suite. And that's really what I think is happening with these cards together.
I think it's also worth noting that Fury hits walkers.
Yeah.
And we're going to get to in a second, but among the most important cards in the format and in these decks is a Planeswalker, very popular right now. And Fury doesn't always kill it on the spot, but it really pressures loyalty count of some of these walkers. And like for a card like Jace or Reminisces, it might even kill it on the spot, depending on how you time them.
Yep. Yeah, and Fury, I think that's one of the things that makes Fury even playable, really. I mean, Fury's a great card. I think it probably would still be playable if it was just Pyrokinesis or whatever. I think that was the name of the card, the pitch card from Alliances that it's based off of. But the fact that it also targets Planeswalkers and that you can split it between creatures and Planeswalkers is massive. It makes you be able to play this card main against control decks and not worry about the fact that you have 8 cards in your deck that are really creature removal, that aren't great in every matchup, but because they're so flexible, they actually are great in almost every matchup. Now, the card that sort of unifies these, and especially unifies these in this archetype, because the 2 cards that we talked about are just at this point modern staples. The next card is Omnath. What's the full name of this Omnath?
It's the Locus of Creation.
Yes, Omnath, Locus of Creation. The card that we thought was nothing, that Everett told us was everything on the Zendikar spoilers episode. Stan is putting one up on the camera in my face right now. Here it is, Locus of Creation.
Here, I'll put up all 4.
Oh, there's all 4 of them. 4 hands to hold you.
Look at his little hands.
Yeah. So, as we know, Omnath, great threat, great advantage engine of different kinds. I think that one of the main things about Omnath, honestly, is that a secret benefit of it is that it's the only card in these decks, and take a look through the deck list and tell me what you think, Stan. It's the only card in these decks that can be pitched to both Solitude and Fury and Endurance, for that matter.
And Force of Negation. Like, it's just, Omnath does everything.
Yeah.
Right? Not only is it perfect with all these pitch spells, it also replaces itself.
Which is absurd.
Yeah, so if it eats a removal spell, NBD, it's pretty hard to kill with Prismatic Ending. Like, you basically need Prismatic Ending in one of these 4 color piles, which they don't always run. Fury can kill it, Solitude can kill it, but they're potentially like 2 or 3 for 1ing themselves.
Yeah. Yeah, where you drew a card off of it.
Right. It can, if it sticks around, it generates a ton of value, right? It can sometimes even enable you to cast spells for free, ostensibly, because it produces mana off your second land drop.
It saves you against aggro decks where it gains life. I think that's a big aspect of this particular, why this card is good as well. Yeah, Omnath really does do everything.
Yeah. It's a 4-mana card that's just backbreaking against burn, right? So it's like, it has play against control, it has play against burn, and it's in so many matchups the best card you can draw, or even the best card to have in your hand because it enables all your other cards.
Yeah. Gives you options in every phase, basically.
I think he's the new mascot of the show.
Shane might have some words about that.
Okay. Well, he's not here.
We'll see. Maybe today it is. It's our mascot today.
So we can make sweeping conclusions on Shane's behalf.
Glad to.
Let's talk about reminisces next.
Yeah, so those are the creatures, and those creatures do appear in basically every shell that we talked about above as 4 of each. They're in the control decks, they're in the elementals builds, they're even in the combo decks that we talked about, the Doomwake deck, the Saheeli Ryfeld, our Guardian-esque versions as well. They all have those cards as full play sets. But there's also 2 really important planeswalkers that goes those as well. Generally, now these cards aren't in every build, but they do seem to be either one or the other is, and sometimes it's both. So like Stan said, let's talk about reminisces first. Reminisces, Modern Horizons, 1 staple card. Everybody thought it was going to go in Jund. Turns out it's just great in a lot of different things. Reminisces in these decks can do a couple of different things. The big one is that it fixes your mana. And it fixes your mana over and over again. And I think that's a big part of what this card brings to these 4-color decks.
I mean, it's really drawing you a card every turn.
Yeah.
As long as you're ticking up, that card is always going to be a land. But depending on the type of other lands you have in your deck, sometimes those lands convert into other pieces of cardboard. But the fact that you can open a 2-lander with Reminisces, if one of those is a fetch, you're just going to be fine for the rest of the game.
Yeah.
More often than not.
Yeah. Even if they kill it after you play it, and it's not easy to kill it after you +1 it because it's 4 loyalty, so you can't bolt it. They'd have to use a Fury on it basically to do it.
Or have Unholy Heat online. Like, that is possible.
Yeah. But you do get a card off of it, like Stan said, as long as you set yourself up right when you play it. But it does a couple of other things too. Importantly, it can kill a one drop out of Hammer or kill a Ragavan if you're on the play. You make it your turn 2 play, which is just totally backbreaking against decks like that, I think, where you have a Planeswalker and you killed one of their premier threats just like that. You can also use it to fuel your drops for future Omnaths. So, using it to +1 for that is important as well. You get kind of like bigger mana explosions and extra life out of Omnath once you do that. And then finally, the control decks tend to run a win condition that you can use with either a combination of Eternal Witness or Renin 6 to be able to do things like cast infinite turns and things like that, or infinite lightning bolts, basically to grind somebody down. They don't come up as much, and some of the decks that we play don't actually have win conditions that can convert off of Renin 6's ultimate, as I mentioned in the breakdown, but it's there and it's a plan that's totally viable.
Okay, let's talk about the last Planeswalker, which is love it or hate it. He's everywhere right now. Either he's the bane of your existence, or he's a 4 of in your deck, or both. That's Teferi Time Raveler.
Yep. It feels like every deck has Teferi in it suddenly, doesn't it? I mean, Blue-White Control, Esper Reanimator, all of these decks, although with the notable exception of the deck that I was playing, didn't have any Teferis, but I think it should have. It's in like every deck.
Yeah, I kind of came to the conclusion after this week of testing that Teferi might be the most important card in Modern right now.
Yeah.
Where you're either playing it to disrupt what your opponents are doing, or, you live in fear of it and have to have a plan against Teferi.
Yeah.
And there's only, in my mind, a handful of the decks at the top of the meta that can just ignore it outright.
Right. Yeah, and it even does lots of other kind of like passive disruption. As we know, it makes counterspells bad. But, a lot of the reason that people play this a lot is because it makes Cascade bad as well. It makes Cascade not work. There's other kind of payoffs like that it just makes not work because of its ability. Anything that you suspend, anything that you try to cast at a weird time.
Yeah. Teferi's not always good. And I think we saw a meta.
It's always great.
That's right. It's always the best walker. No, but we saw a meta game before MH2 where Blue-White Control was playing 1, 2, or even shaving him entirely.
Right.
Where, we didn't have Cascaded, obviously. It was after the Cascade Errata, so like all those Tybalt decks were gone. And the control decks just didn't have Counterspell yet, so they looked totally different. Sometimes they were Stoneforge decks or they were Esper. And we're just in this metagame right now where I think Teferi is either a must-kill or a must-play. And because Blue-White Control is one of the most popular decks in the format, we're seeing a lot of situations where games are just decided on who draws Teferi first.
Yeah. And it gets more complicated too, because you start teching things in your deck that are good answers for Teferi, or you understand that you have to save a Fury to try to kill Teferi, or you're trying to do, you make sure that you hold a Force Negation for when they try to cast their Teferi and hope that when they go for it first, you have a window to cast your Teferi. So there is a little bit of these Teferi mirror kind of sub-game going on that some people love, some people hate, but I think it is the way things are right now.
How do you feel about Teferi's position right now?
I mean, I totally agree. I think it's one of the most prevalent. I think it's one of the most useful cards in the meta right now, and as a result, it's just everywhere. And so you have to know that it's coming. That's the big thing I would say, is that if you're any kind of reactive deck who wants to play at instant speed, you have to remember that it's probably coming in like half of your matches that you're going to play. You're going to see Teferi and you need to know what to do.
All right, maybe we'll come back to some of these cards towards the end of the episode, because I'm eager to talk about the decks we played.
Yep. Yeah, thanks for the digression. I think what we should do is hop to the hype deck of the week, which Stan played.
Yes. 4-color YoRhinos.
Yep.
YoRhinos. Doomwake, he was trophying with this deck, I think, by Monday, if not even like the tail end of the previous week.
So I believe that the Twitter account was, and, shoot us a note if we're wrong, leave us a pod in box if we're wrong. But I think that, Doomwake was kind of updating online after he put this list together and was, I think he went 22-3, including a 10-0 run at the beginning where he got 2 trophies in a row with the first couple times he took it through leagues. And then Tunneling Cat, who's another kind of trophy competitor, also got a 5-0 the first time they played it.
That's right. This is not the first version of 4-color Cascade with Rhinos. In the earlier days of MH2, there was a 60-card 4-color version that splashed white for Ardent Plea, and it was only Ardent Plea, so that you can have 12 Cascade spells in your deck. Eventually, it streamlined, became more consistently a Temur version, and Devin O'Donnell, aka Doomwake, has been coming and going and working on Footfalls basically this whole time. And some of the innovations we've seen in the deck that are more or less staples now, including Prismari Command, which is basically in every version of the deck. Pretty sure Doomwake was the first person to run that card and kind of sing its merits about how effective it was as a pitch spell, or just a metagame tool for what was happening in post-MH2 Modern.
Yeah, I mean, it digs. It kills an artifact if you need it to, which is important to get rid of Chalice of the Void. You're almost never going to face Chalice on 3 against a Cascade deck, and then it also lets you do a little bit of damage here and there if you need to, or make a treasure, so you can actually ramp a little bit off of it as well.
But even though this new 4-color Yorion version is kind of on the up and up, we saw it appear in 2 top 8s that we talked about, came in second place in the Saturday Challenge. The Temur version, the more streamlined 60-card deck, it's just been around for months. I think many of our listeners, if not most, are familiar with it. It won last Sunday's Modern PTQ, basically a staple in these challenges. It's in every league, of course. I think it's proven itself to be more than just like a flash in the pan made possible by Shardless Agent. Unlike some of those Asmo food decks, which came and went, I think these Footfall decks have proven to be very resilient.
Yeah.
And we'll talk about why in a second. I do want to maybe itemize some of the key differences in the construction of the 4-color and the Temur versions, because it's not just the addition of 4 Ardent Plea, which then in turn makes the 80-card Yorion deck have 12 Cascade cards,
right?
As opposed to Temur, which just has 8. In order to pad the Footfalls deck, Doomwake is also running 4 Solitude, because it's maybe the best creature in the format.
And 4 Fury as well.
Right, which it does exist in Temur.
Right. Got you. Yeah, so you're talking about differences, but yeah, good point.
Likewise, we're now adding 4 copies of Teferi Time Raveler, potentially the best card in the format. We talked about Omnath, Locus of Rage. We got 4 of those because we have room, card's good. It can be pitched to any of the free spells in this deck, and it provides just another potential closer if the Footfalls deck sees any type of hate, whatever hate you're playing against the Cascade combo doesn't really touch Omnath itself. And those are really the only other new cards, right? The rest is extra lands. We got some Reflecting Pools, we got more fetches to play with Omnath, but it's not like we're adding chaff to make this deck bigger. We're just putting in some really great cards.
You're adding 16 cards here and 4 lands, is if this follows like what you're talking about.
Right.
So there you go.
Mm-hmm. The Temur deck, the core of it has remained largely unchanged since the deck emerged. There's just a handful of flex spots that have been updated here and there. Prismari Command, I mentioned, was one of them. Seasoned Pyromancer has been getting really popular lately as a way to help refill your hand after you maybe used up a lot of your pitch spells like Force of Negation or Fury early on. Maybe if you have dead cards in hand because your opponent played a Chalice or a Teferi, you can use a Seasoned Pyromancer to make some tokens while getting rid of those dead cards.
A great card. You don't see it enough, Seasoned Pyromancer. It's nice to see it come up in this build for sure.
Yeah, it's really, really sexy, dude. Also, the Temur version has Dead and Gone pretty consistently, whereas Doomwake's 4-color version ran none. It was all in on Fire Ice. Temur actually has a mix of Fire Ice and Dead and Gone, but I think maybe we're splitting hairs there a little bit. In terms of why I think these Footfalls decks have been around for so long and maybe have proven themselves to be more resilient within the metagame than something like the food decks, which kind of came and went, I think the most important one to point out is that these decks are just insanely consistent. And it's really designed to do one thing over and over, and that's cascade into Rhinos. So that unless the opponent has very specific hate cards, you're just always going to do your thing.
Do you feel like the YoRhian version is equally built to do cascade into Footfalls as the 60 card is?
Yes. So, I'm just going to fast forward. One of the things that we did in preparation for this episode is we crunched some numbers. We revisited our friend, the hypergeometric calculator, probability calculator. I mentioned that the YoRhian version has 12 cascade cards, right? It's got Ardent Plea, Violent Outburst, and Chartless Agent, 4 of each. We're not including Footfalls in and of itself here.
Right.
Because you don't really ever want to actually pay the green for the Footfalls.
Right.
With those 12 cards, in an 80-card deck, you're about 70% to have a cascade card in your opening hand.
That's pretty good. 2/3. Yeah.
Pretty good. And obviously the number goes up with each draw if it's not on your opener.
Right.
The Temur version, on the other hand, with only 8 cascade cards, you have a 65% chance to have a cascade spell in your opening hand.
Surprise.
So with those numbers, I think you can make the case that perhaps the YoRhian version is more tuned to cascade into Rhinos and potentially has an easier job of not having dead draws because you're less likely to draw the Rhino card, whereas you're more likely to draw a cascade card.
Yeah, totally counterintuitive, I think. When you first saw it, it felt like when I first saw the YoRhian deck, that it was kind of like, okay, what we're doing is we're hedging against a plan that is often really good, but you need to draw into it, and it doesn't always outright win you the game, but it often outright wins you the game by subbing in more interaction that doesn't get cascaded into in the form of more elementals and Omnath and things like that. But like you said, in reality, the math says that you're more likely to draw the cards that you want to make cascade go off in this deck than in the smaller one, which is very wild. And I don't think necessarily what people would think just looking at the deck list.
Totally. And we get to do both. We had our cake and eat it too, where not only are we more likely to draw into a cascade card, but we are also running more interaction, be it Teferi or Solitude. We still have the Force of Negations, we still have Fire Ice, we still have Brazen Borrowers and Prismari Command to maybe deal with whatever your opponents are doing, be it hate in the form of Chalice or Engineered Explosives or Teferi itself. But then also, some of these interactive spells, especially the creatures, they're also your threats. They're alternate threats. So while in a perfect world, you might be able to do some end step Petty Theft to bounce a Chalice and then use 3 more mana to Violent Outburst into some end of turn Rhinos, that doesn't always work out. You really have to have like a 3-card combo practically in that situation. And instead, if you run into hate and you don't and you don't have like an anti-hate piece, you have all these other powerful creatures then that can also just serve as threats. And something like Seasoned Pyromancer to potentially ditch cards too.
So what's it like playing the 2 different decks? Like, do you feel like they're very different outside of the percentages you talked about, or do you think that it's a similar style and just for different times of the metagame?
Right. Okay. So great question, Dave. Thank you. I think the key difference. So I did 2 leagues. Okay. I did a 4-color league and then I did a Temur league, and I played a ton of Temur in the months prior to this episode.
Yeah. You've been on it for a long time. All the times that Shane was doubting whether it was a real deck or not.
Yeah, I was just like, Shane, it's good.
Yeah, it's good. It's still good. And it gets to play Cryptic Command sometimes.
Trust fam. Well, I don't know if I like the Cryptic Command versions.
Right,
I
but you know, different points in time, but one of your favorite cards.
I love Cryptic Command. Jace sometimes rears his ugly head. I don't know if that card belongs in the deck either, but it has a lot of my favorite cards and some fun new ones. Here's what I think the difference between the two of them is. This Yorion pile is more powerful because it has more good cards, which is not to say that it has better cards. It just has 20 extra cards that are all really, really good, including Teferi and Solitude.
Totally.
The Temur version, however, even though you're about 5% less likely to have a Cascade spell in your opening hand, I do think it has a little bit of a better reactive counterplay strategy because you are alternatively more likely to draw your, hate pieces or your interaction. So while, the Yorion deck still has Prismari Command, by virtue of there only being 4 Prismari Command and that being the only main deck artifact hate you have, true hate, that isn't a Teferi bounce, I think you're more likely to be in a situation with a Temur deck where you will draw into the thing you need to actually get out of a tight spot.
Right.
Whereas the Yorion deck is a little bit better at saying, I can't combo off, so I'm just going to play an Omnath and hope that does the thing.
Yeah, and I think one other thing that you could look at there too is that it probably depends on what decks you think you're going to see, right? So if you're seeing a lot of decks that have main deck hate for Footfalls, people who have Teferi and people who have Chalice of the Void, then it might be that the 4-color version isn't really great. But if you're seeing Burn and you're seeing decks that have a lot of creatures that you want to kill, I think that adding that extra, because that's essentially what you're doing, right? When you add Solitude and you add Omnath, you're adding a great value engine that actually helps you against Burn a lot, and you're adding another card that is a free creature kill card in Solitude. And so I think that those help you if you're playing against, I don't know, Hammer a lot maybe, or things like that, where you're kind of like, oh, I got to kill creatures. You probably have increased odds to draw that kind of interaction, but you're right, you don't have increased odds to draw Prismari Command or Force and Negation, which are important in different metagames, kind of.
Right, and don't get me started on post-board games,
right?
Which I think can be very important with a deck like this because of your post-board plan in general is to swap, weak interaction for better interaction to run alongside your combo. I only cited my combo out once across my 2 leagues, but I did do it. Sometimes I feel like I just have to.
Was Jarvis, you there to say anything about it this time or no?
Fortunately not. But we'll get into it later maybe. But in any case, when you are counting on things like Mystical Dispute or Endurance or Force of Vigor to deal with whatever your opponent is throwing at you, when you're running an 80-card deck, you're just less likely to draw into those sideboard cards.
Yeah.
And something like Blood Moon, I think, makes you favored with the Temur version against Tron. Whereas finding that Blood Moon in the 4-color version, which I don't think Blood Moon is even in the 4-color version, you can't run Blood Moon.
You blow yourself up, kind of.
Yeah, you just blow yourself up. I think that makes your Tron matchup quite a bit worse.
Yeah. Yeah, you run Obsidian Chainmaw instead, which is like not as good.
It's not as good. It costs 5.
Yeah.
Right? And you're not a ramp deck.
Right.
I don't think you're playing that for Tron, really.
Obsidian Chainmaw? No, you...
I mean, you bring it in, but that's not like... You're not playing it because it's your Silver Bullet Tron hate, because by the time you're casting it, they probably have Tron already.
Well, you can if you're on the draw, you can cast it on turn 2 because you have to be on the if you're on the play, you can cast it on turn 3 when they only have 2 Tron pieces out. I think that's the ideal play pattern for that against Tron is like you play red 1 for it and blow up one of their 2 Tron lands. I think is like what people are trying to do with that in this deck, because like you said, they can't play Blood Moon and they don't really want to play Alpine Moon either. It's kind of not good enough.
This spell costs 1 less for each land your opponent controls that can produce colorless mana.
Right.
Okay. Yeah, so it's better on the play than on the draw, which is true of Blood Moon too.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Good call. I don't think that, so I did play against Tron, but it was only with the Temur version. I don't think I had to make that decision ever with 4-color, so I don't think that interaction occurred to me.
Yeah. Well, I played against Tron with my 4-color build, and it had Obsidian Chainmaw. And the only game I won against Tron was when I dropped Chainmaw on turn 3, and then the next turn I cast Ephemerate on it. So I killed one of their lands. Then so they were hobbled for a turn, and then on my next turn I cast Ephemerate on it and killed another one of their lands, and then killed another one of their lands later. So it actually got me to turn the corner. But anyway, I think that's what people are trying to do with that. I don't think it's a great plan against Tron, but sometimes you get lucky.
Yeah.
So speaking of matchups.
Yeah. So here's the thing. I mentioned I played 10 matches, 2 leagues. I played a lot of the same decks over and over.
Yeah, me too this week for what it's worth. But
yeah, and my matchup research was really hard because I kind of came to this conclusion that I'm a dog against any deck with Teferi Time Raveler, and I'm have a fighting chance or even favored against any deck that doesn't have Teferi.
Yeah. And it's because the Cascade combo is still important enough, even in the 80 card deck that has backup threats. You think that Teferi really messes with you still?
Oh, 100%. Because even if they landed Teferi, if you don't have a Cascade in your hand, the Teferi decks are still good against whatever else you're doing. Mm-hmm. Right? Like, Supreme Verdict is still solid against Omnath or Solitude or whatever elementals you play. And I think because you're 70% to have a Cascade card, you're more likely to draw into it, and thus you're more likely to kind of fold to your opponent's hate. So that kind of sucked. I did have, several other matchups, and then I think from my experiences with the deck, I can infer my
your other ones. That's my other ones too. So please,
this is the inference episode.
Yeah.
So with Hammer, I actually feel like this is a pretty winnable / favored matchup for the False decks because you have main deck Artifact Hate. You sort of need it to deal with Chalice of the Void, but all your removal helps, win you that game too.
Right.
So even if you don't draw into a Prismari command, pitching a Fury to maybe deal with 3 or 4 of their creatures will sometimes just win you the game on the spot.
Yeah, plus you have Solitude that can get rid of something that has Hammer attached to it. So if you get to the point where, you get to blockers, you throw down a Solitude, it's kind of tough for them to interact with that. They really don't have any way to do it other than Giver of Runes, and you have a pretty easy time getting rid of Giver. So I think that makes sense. I think, personally, a lot of the decks that have Fury and Solitude main are probably favored against Hammer, and I'll say as much when I talk about what I played as well, but...
Right on. I even think that if the Hammer deck doesn't suit up a creature with a Hammer or, a Nettle Cyst, your Rhinos just outclass all their creatures too. Mm-hmm. So if they decide to block, that's kind of their own undoing as well. Jund is an interesting one where I think you get a lot better post board, even though game 1 can be kind of tough. Though game 2 and 3 get a bit better since their tools to strip away your combo and even outclass Rhinos get worse when you're bringing in things like Blood Moon and Endurance, or sometimes even Clothis to shrink their graveyard, present a new threat that is really hard to deal with, or just shut them out of the game entirely with Blood Moon. Mm-hmm. Burn, coin flip, in my mind. It's really about who gets the faster start and what type of interaction the Rhinos deck draws. I think one of the turning points with Rhinos is if you can Cascade with at least 10 life, you'll probably close out the game. You do have a somewhat painful mana base, though, especially in the Yorion version because of Omnath, and really just for the sake of padding your cards, you are running a ton of fetches. Mm-hmm. So you're doing a lot of damage to yourself. You're basically fetching almost every turn. So I think that can make the burn matchup a little harder. And then drawing into Omnath, that will sometimes win you the game, but your odds of drawing into Omnath aren't necessarily great.
Yeah. Do you ever feel like you would be in a situation where you would exile your own creature with Solitude to gain 4 life at instant speed? Or do you think that that's just kind of not happening? Your creatures aren't big enough. Feels a little corner casey to me.
Yeah, it's super corner casey. I think it really depends on your life total and whether you can still win. Mm-hmm. So I can see myself maybe solituding my own Rhino if I have less than 10 life and they, have 2 or 3 cards in hand and maybe a Boros Charm on the stack.
Right, totally.
But I think that's kind of like a Hail Mary with the hopes of winning in a turn or 2 after they've exhausted themselves.
Yep.
I like that play, though.
I had to double check the wording on Solitude to make sure you could do it. So you can.
Yeah. All right, Murktide is interesting because an unchecked Regent is super scary, and you essentially have to draw either Dead and Gone and play the Gone version of it, or a Brazen Borrower to potentially win, because the 8/8 flyer is just untenable for the Rhinos deck otherwise.
Well, Solitude.
Again, so that's if you have the 4-color version,
right?
And Teferi too. But like, I'm here to make the case that the 4-color version isn't necessarily the superior version in every situation.
Okay.
I think you can make a strong argument for both, and Temur is still defensible, just because like your sideboard is so key in so many matchups, and being able to play better interaction post board is what's I think going to help you kind of turn the corner, as opposed to the Yorion deck where you're relying on really powerful main deck cards to just kind of be favored in any situation.
Can you give your impression for both decks going forward? Then maybe say like 4-color this, Temur this.
Yeah, I think you want to play 4-color if you're up against a ton of control, because you also have Teferi.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I think 4-color is the better deck if you're nervous about Teferi, especially.
Yeah.
And then Temur is really good if maybe people are shaving Teferis and chalices.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can just be a little bit more streamlined and surgical with the type of interaction that you have access to.
Yeah.
Living End is another one that gets really good post board, but their cascade payoffs are just better than yours, to be honest. And if they cascade into Living End, your Rhinos are just kaput.
Yeah, nowhere near as good.
Yeah, so this is a matchup where I think with Temur, Force of Negation is basically your best card, or Endurance and Blood Moon post board. And then if you've got the 4-color version, you really want to find either Force of Negation or Teferi.
Yeah.
And to hope that is enough to keep them from doing their thing.
Yeah. And you should be able to hold them down for a while with the Teferi in Living End. They don't have tons and tons of things to do with it, but they can take it out of your hand. But
yeah. What do you think about the Elementals matchup? I never got to play it.
I think that 2 4/4s are kind of just okay against Elementals, but if you hit it really early, then you can be faster than Elementals. And they don't always have Force of Negation main. And so you really don't have anything to stop Cascade main in the deck, unless you play the version like, so it really depends. Like the version that Robert Hayes had at the Energy Series this week, he was playing Teferi Time Raveler main. The build that I was playing over the weekend did not, and I really wish it had. So then at least you have some outs against Cascade main deck. But on the other hand, your creatures are pretty big. You can kill Rhinos with Solitude if you have to. So I think that it's probably a medium kind of one.
I think my educated guess is that it's winnable, but Elementals has the edge.
Yeah. I feel like Solitude or Fury into Ephemerate is so good against Rhinos that it's probably, because if I have Solitude and Ephemerate, then I just get rid of everything that you just cascaded into and move along. So yeah, I'd say it's probably a little bit towards Elementals after talking it through some.
All right, Tron. God, I love playing against Tron lately. Tron just doesn't beat anything except maybe your deck.
Yeah, it does.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I felt really favored against Tron, and I lost a game to them because they were on the play and they had turn 3 Tron into Karn Liberated and just took over.
Right.
But game 1, I was able to take them down with a little bit of interaction and having Rhinos early. Game 3, Force of Vigor, Blood Moon, both are really good against them. And that was pretty much all I needed to win that one.
There you go.
Mill came in second place in NRG.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel vindicated for us having Mill in our list of, matchups to keep an eye out for. I think in both versions of Footfalls, Mill is pretty winnable if you can cascade on turn 3 or 4.
Mm-hmm.
It is within the realm of possibility that they're just going to mill all of your Footfalls cards, and then you're kind of stuck.
Or they surgical you.
Yeah, if they do one and then surgical, you're in a lot of trouble, because even if you can get to 5 mana to cast a Fury perhaps and attack for 6 every turn, they have tools to kill your other ancillary threats, whether it's Fury or Brazen Borrower or Omnath.
Yep.
So I think you really have to get lucky with the combo and then try to just beat them down with 2 or more Rhinos. And this is not a matchup where, in my mind, having a plan B is a really viable solution.
Mm.
With Yawgmoth, I think your game 1 is decent, and your games 2 and 3 are quite good because of Blood Moon and Endurance. Though all of your main deck removal in game 1 can buy you a lot of time to just combo down before they have their combo online, whether it's Fire Ice or Dead and Gone to just deal with their Mana Dorks or Ignoble Hierarchs, or hitting an Undying creature kind of feels weird sometimes, but if you can time it where that even if their creature with Undying is chilling with a 1/1 counter, it then puts them in a position where they don't want to block because they're going to lose it forever, and it makes it harder to execute a combo with it, or they don't get to get a 2-for-1 in their advantage with an Eldritch Evolution either.
Right. And Fury is giant against them too, because it kills Yawgmoth and it can also kill multiple Mana Dorks, like you said. So you can do a lot with Fury just on its own too.
The blue-white control matchup, I think, is nearly unwinnable.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Basically, I maybe I took a game here or there. I never could win a match against blue-white. I wasn't so salty that I was scooping to Teferi, but, even just the regular blue-white control deck right now, having access to both Teferi and Chalice, it feels pretty backbreaking.
Yeah, it's a lot of different types of hate for you to work your way through.
Yeah. And when I mentioned that I was playing against a lot of the same type of decks across my 2 leagues, I just kept running into Teferi decks.
Yeah.
Like, there was a point where I played 3 Teferi decks in a row, and they were all different versions of the deck.
Card's good. People want to play it.
Last matchup I threw in today because of this weekend's results was Reanimator. And I think you can get there if they don't have Teferi, but he really swings the matchup in their favor if they do.
Yeah.
And not all Reanimator decks are running Teferi, but I think nowadays we see a reason to go Esper or, some version that has access to blue-white in order to run Teferi in addition to your Reanimator combo. So I think that's going to be a tougher matchup for Footfalls moving forward.
Yep, that makes sense.
So just to close out, I will say this does remain a contender for me in Vegas personally. It's actually the only modern deck I have the Temur version I have sleeved up still.
Right.
Sitting in a nice box behind me. Here, I'll point to it.
Mm-hmm. That's a good radio.
Yeah.
So when you think about playing this or, Blue-Eye Control was sort of your clubhouse leader at the end of last week's show, kind of what do you think about that comparison right now?
I just think we're in a situation where it's like either you try to beat Teferi or you play Teferi.
Mm-hmm.
And when I find myself in those situations in any format, I want to be the enemy. Like, I'd rather play the card that people are afraid of and are trying to outplay. And what's interesting about Teferi than something like Footfalls, which I think, people are trying to beat Footfalls decks. Like, that's why we're seeing Chalices in so many strategies.
Right.
I think the difference with Teferi is that he has legs just for so many matchups and changes the rules of the game so fundamentally that it's important to maybe be the person who's asking that question and maybe demand an answer from someone else while you have your own interaction in your back pocket the whole time.
Right.
So we'll see. I mean, Vegas is a little over a month away. Or no, it's a little less than a month away.
Oh, yeah. I think it's 3 weeks away, we could say.
3 weeks away. A lot can still happen in the format. We're not going to see a ban, but we could see the format evolve a little bit. But this is where I'm still trying to choose between Footfalls and Control for that day.
Yep. Sounds great. All right. Well, thanks for taking us through that deck, the hype deck of the week, and reminding us a bit about the previous version that's still very, very viable and very successful too. So, lots of different ways to go there. So let's talk about the more simple version of this deck, four color elementals itself. And I think it's especially timely given that a deck that was close to what I played, like we mentioned, won the Energy series earlier this week after Elementals just by itself being a little bit quiet recently, I think on Moto at least, although the Yorion versions and the Control-ish versions that have a lot of the shell are really, really good still. I think that part of what's been going on with this deck lately is that the versions that have a combo are a bit better, a bit more popular, and the versions that are Control have a little bit more game maybe against Control, and so this one that's just straight creatures has gotten a little less popular as Control has gotten better because this deck does not want to see a Supreme Verdict, and it has one of the things that this deck is really, really good at doing is that I think it thrives in a meta that has a lot of creature decks and aggro decks so that you can kind of just be better at getting through the mid-range. You play better threats, you get better value out of your cards than they can, but if you're in a matchup where Solitude and Fury are bad, your deck is kind of bad, really, in a lot of ways. Now, the builds here are different. Like we said, Robert Hayes from the Energy series played Teferi in the deck, which I think actually helps it a lot more in the current moment in the metagame. Deck I was playing had Ren and 6 in it. Like I said, I thought it was fine, helped a lot with mana, but didn't really add a lot to the deck beyond that. So generally this week, I had the same problem that Stan kind of had playing against the decks that I managed to play against. I only managed to get one league in, but I only played against Jeskai Stoneblade, which was a Teferi deck that also had Fury and Solitude in it. I played against a blue-white Lantern Prison deck that had Solitude in it. So I had some Solitude and kind of like back and forth going on there. I played against Elementals, 4-color Elementals, and then I played against the Cascade Elementals deck that Stan was talking about, the 4-color Temur deck, and I played against Tron. So 4 of the decks that I played against had Solitude. 3 of them had Fury and Solitude both. And I think 4 of them had Teferi Time Raveler. in them. So I had a lot of kind of stuff getting bounced, not being able to cast cards on their turn, having to work around that. Stuff that made me feel like I wasn't quite sure how good this version of this deck is right now. And one of the main reasons is that I don't think I ever really got going with Risen Reef in any of the games that I had, where I wasn't really able to turn it into kind of like the incredible card advantage engine that it is in so many decks, because I think people know that you have to kill it now. Yeah. And maybe for a while people didn't realize that you could get away with that.
And the first trigger just isn't enough.
I mean, it's good. I definitely felt good about it, but it's not, you know, I would have rather played, if I'm only going to get that first trigger, I'd rather play Muldrifter, unless, you know, if you hit a land and ramp, it is pretty good, because then you're talking about being able to do like Omnath plus a fetch land on the next turn, and you get a lot of stuff going on with that if you manage to pull that off. So yeah, I had kind of like a complicated way with this deck, playing it, so many triggers, so many different things going on. I think that we've talked a lot about the core cards of this deck, but I will just point out some of the things that might surprise people. One is that a lot of the version that I played, and I think a lot of the versions that are out there right now, are playing multiple Muldrifters as a way to be able to increase the amount of card draw that you get off of your ephemerates. It lets you be able to get going with just kind of like smoothing the wheels when you get to kind of like turn 3 and you're not sure what else you're supposed to be doing, because the deck is pretty reactive. A lot of times you kind of end up sitting there holding Solitude and Fury until you have a good time to cast them, because you want to get value off the come to play triggers. Prismatic Ending, in my mind, is one of the most important cards in this deck, because it helps you get away from things that can kind of main deck hose you in different ways, or even post sideboard hose you. Things like Blood Moon, like Stan mentioned, or things like Ensnaring Bridge, or things like those things that you run into where you're not really sure where it's coming. You know, I played against one match where, you know, the prison opponent brought in Torpor Orb against me, and it's like all of my cards are bad against Torpor Orb. So I needed to figure out how to like kill an Ensnaring Bridge and also kill a Torpor Orb in different matches there, where so that I could continue with my plan. So there's a lot of ways to mess with the creatures in this deck, and you don't have the fallback of, you know, like a Yorion plan where you're pulling in something that's really powerful from the sideboard. You know, I was playing with Kahira, the Orphan Guard, who's like a lord for elementals more than anything else. Never cast it, never put it in my hand the whole time. So I'm not sure how great it is. It's fine, but never really had time to do that. And the other thing is, you know, I didn't have a combo to fall back on. So,
well, you do have Omnath, which is just a combo with all your lands.
Yeah, I mean, Omnath, great. It helps you against other aggressive decks. You draw a card with it. You can ephemerate it to draw extra cards. It lets you have those really broken turns where you do get to hard cast a Fury and a Solitude in the same turn. Sometimes where you're kind of like, okay, well, I got Omnath out, and Omnath is protected, and now I'm going to cast 10 mana worth of stuff on turn 5 or something, or, you know, sometimes even on turn 4 if you manage to ramp into it with Risen Reef, like I mentioned. But it did feel like there was a lot of kind of like ups and downs to me when I was playing this deck. One thing that's interesting is Robert also had Utopia Sprawl in his deck, and I did not have Utopia Sprawl in the build that I was playing. The build that I was playing was by Magic Online player Corfuria, who went 4-0 in a prelim a couple of days ago with it.
Okay.
Yeah. Instead of Utopia Sprawl, I was playing Eldamri's Call. And I'll tell you, that was another card that I felt like was just kind of okay as I was playing it. So anyway, we've talked about the cards that are in this deck a lot. Why don't we talk about some of the matchups or my impressions of what I think the matchups could be like for this deck at this point in time. And you haven't played against, or haven't piloted this deck at all, right, Stan? Just this version?
Not this version. The last time I piloted Elementals was when we did Tribal Week.
Oh, yeah.
Many moons ago.
Yeah. I mean, you've played something close to it because you've played all the good cards from it at this point, well, but
minus the pitch element. Right. I played with the pitch elementals, just never with an elementals tribal deck.
Right. So starting with our kind of list of matchups, Hammer, as we mentioned when Stan was going through his deck, I think that elementals has been pretty good against Hammer because of all the interaction with creatures. I feel like we kind of covered that in the 4-color Cascade version, but having both damage and exile effects is huge. And then you can also bring an artifact interaction from the side in the form of Foundation Breaker and Force of Vigor, things like that really help you in that situation. Even occasionally, if you want to like try to, I mean, that's kind of like where you would go with that. Jund, I still think that elementals might be able to get more 2-for-1s than Jund can realistically, and be able to just play more threats than Jund can kill. And so while Jund gets to do fun things with Shadow Spear and with Urza Saga to make extra tokens, and I think that you can kind of keep a lid on it, especially with all the creature removal that you have. You can kill their Ragavan. You do have a tough time killing Tarmogoyf with Fury, of course, because it gets bigger than that pretty quickly, but you have Solitude. And so you can kind of top out there and do a lot of stuff. You can kill their Ren in 6 pretty easily with Fury and things like that as well. So I think that the check mark goes with elementals, mostly because your 2-for-1s are better, and also you have legit card draw on the deck that I think can help you recover from discard spells if they are really going with that early on. Burn. I think that this matchup is actually probably pretty decent for elementals too, because you can pitch Fury and kill their early threats, and then potentially, if you're careful with your fetching, you can keep your life total pretty high. You run a number of basic lands in this deck. I was running 2 forests, a plains, and an island in the build that I had, so I had ways to bring mana in untapped without taking extra damage from it. And you don't have a ton of early plays that you want to make that you have to make in order to get your game plan going. So you can wait and see how life totals evolve before you figure out, you can bring a shock land in tapped because you're really not trying to do a turn 1 play, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that having the pitch elementals helps you do stuff while you're not taking too much damage from your mana. But keep in mind, I think in order to stay viable, you have to be really conservative with your mana and work towards just getting Omnath online as fast as possible.
So I played that matchup from the burn side, and I kind of felt like Omnath was unbeatable in most situations.
Yeah. I mean, you are the only, there's no way for Burn to kill an X4 in the main deck, right? Like most of what Burn tries to do is rely on totally forgetting the name of the card suddenly, the one that targets a creature and then does 3 damage to the opponent. You know what I'm talking about? Blazing.
Searing Blaze?
Searing Blaze, yeah. You're concentrating on Searing Blaze as a way to kill something and get some extra damage in at the same time for your mana. And that's just not super effective here because you can't really kill the threats. I mean, you can kill Fury and Solitude with it, but, we're all looking at Omnath here.
Yeah.
Murktide. It feels like 0 mana interaction that kills Murktide is good. But the counters are probably tough to get through sometimes, especially in versions that play Force Negation main. I know that they don't always play a lot of those main, right? Stan Murktide's not always playing 4x Force main, right?
Sometimes it's like 1 or 2.
Yeah, that's what I thought too. So you're kind of keeping yourself covered in that way. Fury versus Ragavan and Dragon's Rage Channeler is generally pretty good. I think as far as those things go, it's a situation where you can often turn your Fury into a card neutral play. That's the thing that I think is different between Fury and Solitude, is that Solitude is pretty much always card disadvantaged when you pitch, right? It's a 2-for-1. Unless you get to Ephemerate and they have a lot of targets out, and then you can kind of even it out. But with Fury, sometimes you pitch a red card, pitch your Fury, and then you kill 2 of their creatures, and then you're feeling pretty good about that exchange because you're keeping on pace. And then, who knows, if you get in a situation sometimes where someone has multiple, a third target out there somehow, you can feel really, really good about it. It's not going to happen in a Murktide matchup, but so I think that it can be tough for Murktide to keep up with the card advantage here.
The Murktide itself must be a problem, though.
Yeah, I mean, you only have Solitude as an out to that, and if you're playing Teferi, then you can bounce it, which is nice. If you're not playing Teferi, then yeah, I think it is a pretty big problem that you have to keep an eye out for. I did not play this matchup directly, but you do draw a lot of cards. So I think you probably can get to Solitude if you want it. It's just a question of whether they have the mana up to counter it when you cast it or not. And they can't force a negation your Solitude anyway. So you get in the situation where they wait to make sure that they have it covered. So
did your version have Flamekin, David Harburger?
I did not have Flamekin Harbinger in the deck. Seems like a good piece. I was looking at the deck and kind of not picking versions that had that, but the one that I played had Thunderkin Awakener to be able to bring back your Risen Reefs, which is kind of an interesting play to draw a card. But I think Flamekin Harbinger is probably better to make sure that you get a Solitude more often when you really, really need it.
Yeah, maybe that's a meta call as well.
Yeah.
When you need to have some of these surgical elementals to help interact with certain problem cards.
Yep. Living End and also Footfalls. So the build that I had didn't have a lot of tech to help with this. I think that it's pretty easy to move your deck over to be able to have cards that are good against Cascade, in particular Teferi, that I've talked about a bunch of times here that I wish I had in my deck. But, Living End, you don't have any mass creature kill, so if they get going, you're just kind of done. You can't recover from a Living End that's cast. There's no way to kill the creatures that they have there. On the Footfall side, you can kind of Fury and Solitude and block your way through a couple of Rhinos. The problem is if they have it covered where they have an extra Rhinos or another Cascade spell, you don't have any way too many ways to counter spells. You have some Force and Negation in the side, and that's kind of it. So it feels to me like both of these are kind of bad matchups for Elementals now. Could be wrong, but that's my guess. What do you think, having played that so many times?
I haven't played it as many times as you think.
Yeah.
I trust your judgment.
Yeah. And then Tron, that's a really tough matchup. We talked a little bit about the Obsidian Chainmaw kind of thing where you can ephemerate your Chainmaw and take 3 of their lands, but I don't really think it's enough to really do what you hope it's going to do consistently enough against Tron.
The neat thing about Chainmaw, the more we talk about it and I think about it, is that it does the things where...
Oh, Charmaw. Sorry, not Chainmaw, Charmaw.
Charmaw. You know how we talk about Blood Moon versus Tron isn't always enough, right? You need disruption and a clock, and the Charmaw is both of those things.
Yes.
Like it's disrupting the lands and it's presenting a clock that sometimes they can't kill. I think that's kind of interesting.
Yeah, you would think so. I still think it's kind of not powerful enough. It doesn't close the game quite fast enough on its own to do it. So you really, you can't hard mull into Obsidian Charmaw against Tron. It's just a good card in your deck that helps you early, I think. But if you get into a hand where it's like, the only thing I have is Charmaw and enough lands to cast it, I think you still kind of die because your clock isn't fast enough and they can recover. Yawgmoth, classic good matchup for Elementals. Mill, I think, is probably an okay matchup for Elementals because it's tough. Like, actually, thinking about it now, you might be too slow. You don't insta-die to Tasha's Hideous Laughter, which I think is a good thing, but you are constantly searching up you're searching through your library, so you're super vulnerable to Archive Trap.
Do you have Endurance, though, in the 75?
You have Endurance in the side, and some of the decks have one main, so that helps, too, where you can put your graveyard back into your deck. It's definitely a way to get around it post-board. So I think that there's probably a decent back and forth here between those two decks. Your clock is like just a little bit too slow, though, because you so often aren't able to put a strong threat on the board until turn 4.
I just want to rewind briefly. Why is Yawgmoth a classic a good matchup?
Because of Fury and Solitude.
I see.
Like, I think it's just destroyed. It's a creature combo deck, and you have tons of free creature removal. So you can just keep them from ever getting to set up shop, I think.
I buy it.
Yeah. You don't even have that much graveyard hate. You just have Endurance in the sideboard. You don't have anything hard extra after that, but I think it helps. And then Blue Eye Control, I think, is a really bad matchup for Elementals because you don't have a lot of targets for your removal. I mean, you can use Fury on their Planeswalkers. You can use Solitude on their Solitudes if you want to, but really the Supreme Verdict is the biggest problem, I think, where they can just, when you get a board up, they can just hold Supreme Verdict for that and then kill you, and you can't do anything about it because you can't counter it. So you're a little bit too far in, I think. Reanimator, I'm a little unsure about this one, but I think that it's probably really dependent on Solitude because that's the only card that interacts positively with their payoffs. So you bring Endurance in post-board and probably Force a Negation post-board to be able to help disrupt their plans. And so it's probably a bit better then, but I think main, it's not great. Probably pre-board, it's probably not a great matchup.
Sidebar on Reanimator. Spike wins the Modern Challenge Saturday with it.
Mm-hmm.
I played a league match Saturday night, immediately just run up against Spike's deck.
Mm-hmm.
It's just kind of interesting how quickly Moto moves like that sometimes. As soon as someone wins a tournament, and with these rental services in particular, it's on.
Well, even with the YoRhinos deck from earlier this week, like as soon as Doomwake posted that on Twitter and was like, hey, I got a trophy with it, right. There were people in our Discord talking about it. There were people, I think other people streaming it immediately. It moves so fast, which is why I think that it's a good point, Stan, when you said, hey, there's still like 3 weeks between now and when Vegas happens. There's plenty of time for stuff to happen in the meta between now and then. I don't think I'm still confused as to whether Crimson Vow is going to be legal.
It will not, because that weekend is also the Crimson Vow pre-release.
Yeah.
I think, well, there's a sealed tournament on Saturday.
Right.
So that's a good point. I don't think it is, but I could be wrong.
So I only bring that up by way of saying there's not even any new injection of cards coming between now and then of any kind, right? So it's not like, it's not like the Midnight Hunt had a huge effect on Modern. Like there are Midnight Hunt cards in Modern, but it's, you could have 2 or 3 cards that really displace them.
Memory Deluge.
Yeah, Memory Deluge is probably the biggest one right now. I'm sure I'm forgetting something, but...
Faithful Mending.
Yeah, Faithful Mending. Yeah, Consider. So yeah, it makes changes.
As long as we're on this topic, what about the fact that the paper meta and the online meta move at different paces? And let's say like the Monday before Vegas, someone like Spike or Doomwake crack open a new deck that's really powerful.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it's better against the Moto than it is an open field of like 200-300 players in a paper tournament.
Yeah, it's totally true.
Right?
Yeah, I think that's still a thing. I also think that the bigger tournaments just have higher randomness too. Like I remember going to GP, I haven't been to a GP in a long time. The last time I went to a GP was probably 2017, I think, when Shane and I went to play Modern in Indianapolis. I went to a sealed one, but the less constructed one I went to. And I played against like someone's Pack Rat Blood Moon deck, and I played against someone's Spirits deck, not meaning like spirits, but meaning like black-white spirits from Kamigawa block deck. And like you play against random things sometimes, even if you go to a premier event like this. So sometimes you just don't run into meta decks the same way that you are. So you do have to watch how tuned you are for the exact meta, where you're right. On Moto, it's a lot of meta decks or close to meta decks. Like, I think there are people brewing little tweaks. Like, I played against Jeskai Stoneblade, and the whole thing that Jeskai Stoneblade was trying to do was basically just run Fury and Solitude and Teferi together in a Stoneforge shell. So, varying degrees of success. Oh, and Ragavan. It had Ragavan as well.
Yeah. But sorry to cut you off.
That's okay. I think that this deck is a good pick when there are a lot of creature decks floating around. And I think that if you look at, like, if we look at the top 8 of this trial that it just won, you had Hammer, Rhinos. So this, to me, looks like a pretty tough top 8 for Elementals to win. So, take my meta, my matchup analysis with a grain of salt. But it managed to fight through what looks to be a couple of Footfalls decks, a controlled deck, 2 different control decks, and it beat Mill in the final, which I think is probably just about how fast you can get your clock online. But I still think that if there are a lot of creature decks floating around, I think that helps Elementals be better, because it's sort of really focused on just being able to kill creatures as efficiently as possible and then play bigger threats on the subsequent turn. So it's a little bit of that kind of like, it's almost like trying to jund them out in a traditional sense, where it's like, I'm going to kill your stuff and then play better things. And you can't, if you play your earlier on curve threats now, they're not going to be as good because I have Omnath. I think it's risky because the meta turns so quickly. And I think that this particular version of Elementals needs to fit a certain moment really well. And so that's kind of why I think that the version like you played, or the version that Canister played, for example, where it is more of a Bant control-ish deck, or a slightly bigger deck that has more of a proactive plan on itself other than just attacking, might be better fits overall and better fits more often than just this kind of like Risen Reef version of Elementals really is.
I've been pretty hyperbolic about this deck. I'm sure you might agree.
Mm-hmm.
Like I was saying, how it's good against control, it's good against burn. It like can cover these 2 different sides of this metagame. Do you think I was a little too hot on it?
On Elementals?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think it's good against control, personally. I mean, control is tuned right now to be good against Cascade, of course. Right. So, like, Chalice of the Void doesn't mean anything to me.
Right.
But Teferi still means something to me. And Supreme Verdict means a lot to me. So I don't think that this deck is particularly good against control. But
I wonder if part of that is because you didn't get cool Risen Reef Muldrifter synergies going.
Yeah.
Because that felt like the thing. Risen Reef plus Omnath felt like the thing that I, as a control pilot, was
tough to keep up with.
Yeah.
But then you can just sweep the board. And I don't really have a great way to come back from that unless I'm keeping Muldrifter handy, which is like, maybe I am, maybe I'm not. But it doesn't feel great to play Divination basically on a creature.
Right.
You know, as much as I want it to be really good in the situation, I'm not sure if you know, after you wrath me, I really feel like I'm doing it when I'm like, yeah, I played a 2/2 flyer and drew 2 cards for 5. It's for you to just solitude it again. So I don't know. Like I said, I only got a certain amount of testing in with this, and I feel like this deck is really hard to play. There's so, especially in a bunch of things that are essentially mirror matches. So in my notes I had is about, you know, the mirror match against other elementals is really kind of awful and taxing to play because it's just so many comes into play. It's like, what sequence are you going to do? Who's going to blink first and put a threat into play so I can play my solitude so you can play your solitude? And it's like, it's a lot.
Well, what mirror match isn't awful?
Yeah, that's true. So I don't think this is in the consideration set for me if I were to go to Vegas, which probably not going to, but I don't think that this is, I would probably be more inclined to play Jund personally, but that's just me. Then I would play this one. Now, would I go on from here and try some of the YoRhinos ones? I think I probably would, but in that case, I still wouldn't be looking to have a Risen Reef in my deck, I don't think right now.
Can we maybe close out with a little talk about some of these cards that we got to play with in both of our decks? So Solitude, Fury, Omnath, and Teferi, our overlap was, you know, your deck had some of them, and then my YoRhinos deck had some of them.
Right.
I didn't play Ren in 6. You didn't play Ren in 6.
No, I played Ren 6. I didn't play Teferi.
Oh, okay.
Though I think I should have had a split or found a way to play both, or I don't know. But
yeah. I mean, I feel like Teferi is borderline problematic right now. And this could change, right? Like, problematic cards come and go, and maybe he has a long life ahead of him. But I'm a little troubled by the fact that right now he's sort of the backbone of so many decks, and also just like shuts down an entire corner of Modern by himself and becomes the focal point of so many matchups in particular.
It feels like there's so much disruption packed into one card, right? Where it's like, this is the best disruption against counterspells, against things that try to play at instant speed for other reasons, against things that try to cheat with mana, against things that are big threats that I just want to bounce, like Murktide. You know, Teferi's really good against Murktide. So like, I worry about it a little bit too, just because there's not that much diversity in the disruption package that people are incentivized to play right now in that sense. And also, it's just boring to play against. Like, and the other thing is, like, in paper, you just got to remember, like, you can't do stuff on your opponent's turn or like any time that you want to do stuff. And so it's like, you know, Moto helps you not make that mistake, but I got to think, I still hate these planeswalkers with static abilities. It just doesn't feel like they should do stuff, but
you can cycle your Triumph.
Right. Yeah, exactly. That's perfect.
Or you can cycle Shark Typhoon too.
Yeah.
I will say, you know, to that effect, I think Teferi's the first card in this Road to Vegas series that I've played with and against that felt like, I don't know if it really belongs in Modern long term.
What a call.
And I like playing him. You know, like I've owned Teferi's for a long time. I think it's a cool card to play with, but I don't know if that necessarily makes for a better format.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it's a complaint that people have had about that card for a long time. So you may be right. I mean, it's not in Historic. It's not in Pioneer.
Yeah. Now, that said, Solitude and Fury, I think, are awesome.
They're awesome, but I got to tell you, you know, when Solitude was spoiled, people were like, this card is going to be absurd and it's going to make it impossible to play creature decks. And I think for a while there, it kind of seemed like it wasn't true. And then when people realized that Fury was almost as good as Solitude, or as good in other situations as Solitude is in the situations that it's good, the pitch elementals are starting to get kind of like, okay, like a little bit of a collar tug for me, where I'm like, how many mirrors am I going to play where people have an 8-pack of these cards every time? Is that going to go on forever? Or
don't you think, though, that playing them comes with a cost?
Yeah. But
like, if you're 2-for-1ing yourself, bare minimum, or, you know, sometimes with Fury, you can like 3-for-1 your opponent, or like 2-for-2. And the math goes all over the place, but like, I just feel like because they have this built-in cost, and they can be pretty expensive to cast, except for Endurance, like they're all 4 or 5 mana. I feel like they're a little less problematic. They lead to less non-games. They kind of just like sway the metagame in a certain direction.
They just lead to a lot of really grindy games with a lot of kind of like material trading. And it feels like people are really, like you were talking about how decks are really incentivized to play Teferi right now. I feel like decks are really incentivized to play Solitude and Fury right now too. So, which is why we keep ending up with this core of these 5 cards being so prominent in Modern at this moment. Wrenn and 6 doesn't feel problematic at all. You know what I mean? Agreed. It just feels like it's there all the time. Yeah. And Omnath is not as much of a worry as it was to me when we first saw it kind of like coming around, but it's still, it does put a big kind of like lid on aggro, I think. And as well as Burn is doing right now, you know, the decks that are aggressive outside of Burn, I think, are doing very different things to be able to like make their plans possible.
What do you think is the best deck in the format?
I think it might be, I still think I think that there's a chance that it's the deck that you played this week, that it's the
4-color YoRhinos?
Yeah, I think, YoRhinos Rhinos. I think there's a chance that that's the best deck.
I kind of think it's still blue-white.
You think it's still blue-white?
Because we also haven't seen blue-white evolve much.
Yeah.
In the last month or so. It's sort of it's found its shell because it found a metagame that it can attack. But I think because we've been seeing the metagame start to really churn in the last few weeks, I think we could see evolutions to blue-white that help it stay ahead of the pack.
You know, it's just going to be prowess. That's what it's going to be. You're hearing about 2 more weeks. It's coming. It's coming back.
What happened? Like, I keep seeing these Jeskai prowess decks in the league results that do nothing in tournaments.
Yeah, it's because everybody's playing Fury and Solitude.
Yeah, I guess.
Yeah. Imagine playing blue-red prowess and having someone go Fury Ephemerate against you, or Solitude Ephemerate against you, and it's like, okay, I lose 2 creatures this turn, I lose 1 creature the next turn. Like, that's it's tough. All these decks that used to go a little bit wide, it's not easy to do that anymore.
Yeah, I played against one mono red prowess deck with one of my Footfalls versions, I think just Temur, and I kind of just trounced it.
Yeah.
But it didn't have Teferi, so eventually I was able to just like deal with their creatures
and play Rhinos.
Be on my merry way, yeah.
Yeah. All right, well, I think another fun tour around Modern. Not sure how many more of these we have between now and when we actually have the tournament. So maybe what we can do next week is plan to talk with Shane about final thoughts, or maybe we'll see if there's a couple of decks left that we want to look at.
No one's played Living End yet.
True.
Or with it.
True.
I think someone might need to hit up Living End, but that could be an addendum to an episode about other stuff.
We haven't played Reanimator in a little while. You know Shane will want to do that.
That's also true. There you go.
So there's decks left to look at.
We got some ideas in the hopper. Maybe we can get Shane to play both of those decks while you and I just sit back and
take a day off.
Bark orders. All right, that wraps up this week's show. Shane, we missed you. Come back soon. Everyone else, if you haven't yet, make sure you subscribe to our podcast. Get the latest episodes as soon as they come out. And if you use Apple Podcasts, please leave us a rating and review. If you'd like to submit a question to The Dive Down or just reach out in general, you can tweet us at The Dive Down, all one word, email thedivedown@gmail.com, or even submit an audio message. If you have a question for the pod, you might hear it on a future episode of The Dive Down over at podinbox.com/thedivedown. If you'd like to support the show, you can join our Patreon, where joining at any tier gets you access to our definitely discreet Discord server. Find us over at patreon.com/thedivedown. Shout out to Mana Traders for sponsoring The Dive Down. If you sign up for Mana Traders using promo code TheDiveDown2021, you'll get 15% off your first 2 months of renting Magic Online cards. As always, special thanks to the bands Nowhere and Spaceblood for letting us use their music. And until next week, get out there and keep practicing for Vegas, baby!